Hello YouTube. We're trying something else this time. Here we are in beautiful Como in Italy, and instead of me blabbering alone, we will be two people blabbering today for your enjoyment. And over here we have Davide with us in his native Italy. In fact, well, not too close to home, but close enough from my perspective. Recently we published a ancient Rome study where we looked at the recently released ancient Roman genomes, which were published by some academics and which you can download freely. And together with Davide, who's sitting over here, we've analyzed these to test the ancient Rome eugenics collapse of civilization hypothesis. And maybe Davide, you want to summarize the study since you were the main author.
Yeah, this study relied on genomics. This study relied on genomic samples from different periods from central Italy. So they start from the Copper Age, Bronze Age, and then they go all the way from the Iron Age, which is also partially overlaps with the Republican period, followed by the Imperial period, late Antiquity, medieval period, and then I also managed to find a modern sample. And this genomic sample allowed us to test this cyclical theory of civilizations, where the level of intelligence rise and cause an increase in social complexity and civilization. But when the civilization becomes too comfortable, this will relax the selection pressures and cause some dysgenic effects, causing a lowering of the polygenic scores. And so we were able to test this model, and this we actually found in line with our the predictions from our theory that there was a huge spike in the polygenic force for educational attainment and cognitive ability from the Neolithic, Copper Age and Bronze Age to the Iron Age. This increase was about 2 standard deviations, and then it was followed by a decrease. This decrease was not the same magnitude; it was a bit smaller in magnitude to the increase. So the level, the genetic cognitive level, didn't go back to the baseline. If we take the Neolithic period as the baseline, but it was about 2/3 of the way. And after Imperial period, there was another increase in late Antiquity and the Middle Ages. Probably, this actually could also be interpreted as a confirmation of our theory, because the late Antiquity and the Middle Ages were times of unrest and war, and when the civilization collapsed. And the cyclical model of civilization predicts that hard times will actually have an eugenic effect, and so this is what we actually found. But to be honest, this later increase was not statistically significant. So the statistically significant effect was for the lower polygenic score in the pre-Iron Age sample, and the higher one for the Iron Age Republican sample. Although we have to admit that the Iron Age sample was small, was only 11 people, and this out of the total sample of 127, so the results need to be taken with caution. The more reliable effect is the increase from the pre-Iron Age Neolithic sample to later ages, which is in line with what we find with genomes from other parts of Europe and even East Asia. There was in prehistory and throughout history there was a eugenic trend So there was an increase in the genetic scores for education and cognitive ability. So like when we'll get more data, we will be able to test whether the linear model of an increase of the polygenic scores is a better fit to the data compared to a cyclical model.
So that's the main summary of our study. Looking at our questions we got from the readers, of course the criticism is mainly about the small sample of the Republican period, or the Iron Age, which is only 11 people. But it's not really that something we could do about, because as far as we know, this was the only Roman ancient genomics available for study. And so this should be seen really as a tentative first try at this, and when we find more data, at some point it will get sequenced. Ancient genomics is booming. Thousands of samples, I think, come out every year.
Yeah, we already have like some related samples from the Etruscan civilization, which are very similar, very related to ancient Romans, because the Etruscans were absorbed into ancient Rome during the Iron Age, and these were published recently, and we can actually test our model using these as proxies for our Roman sample.
Yes, and that's for this study. The next viewer question is from Peter Frost, and he's interested in Greg Clark's hypothesis, which is that in his book, A Farewell to Arms, he hypothesizes that based on records of marriage and death certificates, wills to when someone dies, you can see that during the Middle Ages in England and maybe Scotland and in the United Kingdom, you can see that the number of surviving offspring, or the surviving number of children that the wills were left to, had a positive correlation with the amount of money in the will and the wealth of this family. So, in other words, it used to be the case throughout medieval times up until around 1900, 1850, depending a bit on the exact location and method, that there was a positive selection for wealth, at least, and for education and occupation status. And so, since these are three well-known correlates and effects of intelligence, we would expect that in this period, Britain, or the UK at least, was under eugenic selection in the same way that we see with the ancient Roman data, and as we'll talk about later, with the other ancient Chinese data and this. Peter Frost's main question is whether we have enough ancient data from Western European sources to test this Clarkian theory in general. Do we have other data, medieval UK data?
We do. We have. I'm currently imputing medieval British data from the early to intermediate Middle Ages, and it's a substantial sample of for over 450 individuals. So it will give us it will enable us to test Gregory Clark's theory. The only problem will be that if Woodley's theory of dysgenics is right, and there was a huge decrease in England in the intelligence in the last century, we would, if we use the contemporary genomes, we won't be able to see. We will have to somehow take into account the potential decrease of intelligence. So it will be. We should also try to get some old samples from the beginning of the 20th century. I guess the UK biobank data has got older people born in the 30s, so this will be a better sample. And this will actually enable us to test the theory, Gregory Clark's theory, that there was something, this effect was stronger in England, because from the data it doesn't look like it's the case, because the modern polygenics for the UK are not higher than other European countries, and according to Gregory Clark's model, they should be higher, because this trend was stronger in England, but Gregory Clark's model could still be correct if we found that a strong dysgenic trend in the last century from the Victorian times to contemporary people. There is some, I already have some suggestive evidence of the decrease from the Middle Ages in Northwest Europe, because I've got increase, sorry, from the Middle Ages, because I've got almost 400 Viking genomes, and these are about half a standard deviation lower than contemporary Western Europeans. So there was, if we assume, of course it's a strong assumption, if you assume that the Vikings had the same, the Vikings were from the Middle Ages at the same level of intelligence as the British, then yes, we have or even other Europeans, then we have some evidence supporting Gregory Clark's theory.
Kind of a recent selection.
Yeah.
So how would the if the Vikings were not mentally superior, at least according genetically, and speaking of course as a former Viking, or for my ancestors anyway, so how were the Vikings able to conquer this? Do they seem to have any other traits? As I recall, they were taller or something in the...
Yeah, the polygenic scores for a Viking is significantly higher than the modern, even modern Northern Europeans, at least modern British and Finnish. So it's possible that physical strength was helped them conquer other populations, and also like some navigation skills and other cultural traits, or even psychological personality traits that we don't know of. Yeah.
So as I recall, the ancient or not ancient, but the historical sources generally describe Vikings as quite tall.
Yes.
And this is what you found also with the Viking
Yeah,
data.
and this was a good test of the accuracy of the polygenic, of the imputation and the polygenic scores, because the polygenic scores actually confirm these historical sources.
Which I think he generally has been previously ascribed to, the medieval farming thing, which I think was unusually strong in Scandinavia, but maybe there was a genetic aspect to this Viking superiority in martial arts or in combat, at least for some time. Yeah. The other question that Peter has, and some multiple other readers have, is that whether there's any GWASs for these other components of Clark's hypothesis. So he's not just saying that there was an increase in intelligence, but also, say, a slower life history or time preference decreased, or maybe violent genomics.
Well, the education GWAS is not purely cognitive. It also includes some life history traits like conscientiousness and slow life history. So it's kind of an omnibus measure it's even a better measure to test Clark's theory. But we also have other measure of schizophrenia, which showed an opposite trend to the education polygenic score. And it's possible that because we know that schizophrenics tend to be much more violent than the general population, so it's possible that selection against violence caused a decrease in the polygenic scores for schizophrenia.
But currently, as I recall, there are not like GWASs of violent crime itself. So you couldn't look directly for this one. I don't think there's any GWASs for time preference either. These traits, though, they have a large importance to many people in social science broadly. There doesn't seem to be enough interest in the genomics community to make sure that they include measures of these.
There is a candidate gene studies of the serotonin J gene. They repeat.
But the CAG or whatever.
But it's only one gene, and it's not very useful for comparing populations, because we know that these traits are polygenic. It could give us an idea, but we know it differs. African Americans have a lot higher risk based on this gene.
It's just I think there was a meta-analysis of these CAG repeats, and whether it's actually predicted testosterone or some of these other things, which also I think is related to the 2G digit or the digit ratio, not the digit span.
Yeah.
And this did not really show much of either of these. So maybe this is one of these early candidate genetics things that won't work, or maybe once the whole genome sequencing comes out from the UK Biobank, we'll be able to calculate the whole genome estimates of the CAG and see if this correlates. I don't think UK Biobank has any violent crime measure, but they must have some other social status that must be a proxy for it to some extent. Yeah. So that would be an interesting one to do. The next question, also from multiple people, is concerning what you were relating to before with the height. And some people ask whether we are at the, if you can estimate the genotypic or say the phenotypic level of intelligence just from the genetics. And the problem with this is that intelligence in a person is a phenotype. It's a realized aspect that involves both the environmental input and the genetic input. So if you only look at the one of these over time, you cannot be sure that this is the one that's driving the trend in the phenotype. So, for instance, in the ancient Romans, they had quite high and genotypic intelligence, at least in this small initial study we did. But it's not really possible to say how this might relate to modern levels of IQ if you were to naively put current West Europeans at 100, supposing we had some perfect intelligence tests. We couldn't really say, based on the potentially higher polygenic scores of the ancient Romans, that these would actually be smarter than us, even if they have higher polygenic scores, because it's possible that our environment improvements are so much better to outweigh this.
Yes.
I think you would agree with this, maybe.
Yeah, I agree with this. Yeah.
So unfortunately, it's not possible to tell only from genetics when the peak of human intelligence was. Or are we currently living in the peak human intelligence? It's all these Flynn debates and the measurement problems.
Also, for ancient Greek, we got the Francis Galton estimates, but these were based, I think, on Greeks from Athens, not the general Greek population. The preliminary data we have from ancient Greek doesn't seem to back up his hypothesis, but it's based because we have data from all over Greece and also Crete, so it's not comparable to the population of Athens. It's possible that at the time there was some selective migration into Athens or some local eugenic trends.
What about comparing the ancient Greeks that you had so far? How do they compare to modern Greeks? Is there data there?
Yeah, it's there was actually, I compared them to modern Greeks, and the modern Greeks are a bit lower than Western Europeans, modern Western Europeans, and there was a very small increase from ancient Greeks to modern Greeks, but that's because the modern Greeks are not so in Greece there was not a strong eugenic trend.
Yeah, it's a bit difficult to say from these kind of data.
Yeah.
The next interesting one, as you already remarked upon, is that there is a question about the prevalence of mental illness among different ethnic groups and even the same population over time. And so there are some GWASs on schizophrenia, bipolar, Alzheimer's, and so on. And so his question is, how do the ancient samples compare to the moderns with the polygenics for these mental problems?
Yeah, the ADHD is not... The ADHD GWAS has conflicting results, and because there is some signal, but it's very small and doesn't reach the significant levels. I think it's because it's not necessary because there was no selection for the genes related to ADHD, but it's probably because the GWAS is not very powerful. And indeed, the predictive power of the ADHD GWAS polygenic score is very low, but the schizophrenia polygenic score has a better predictive ability, and we find a strong effect size for basically all the ancient populations that I tested. They have much higher polygenic risk score of schizophrenia compared to their modern counterparts.
So one could even speculate, if we were to go quite far here, that ancient humans were more deeply religious, since there's a known association with schizophrenia and religiousness, which if you put on your atheist glasses and think of religion from a natural perspective, you would say that religious is about overperceiving agency in inanimate objects, or ascribing agency to kind of random things like the river flooding or earthquakes or volcanoes and this sort of thing. And it would suggest the ancients were genetically more inclined to ascribe like the ebbing and the flow of, say, the Nile to some river god, or
not just religion, but also magic. Like the ancient had widely believe in magic, and magical thinking is one aspect in our modern rational culture is an aspect of the schizophrenia of the diagnosis. So it's likely that they were somehow beneficial in more primitive societies, the schizophrenia alleles, because they help people make sense of their world, either through magic or through religion. And
Maybe.
indeed we find in modern populations, even among modern populations, that we find like a big gap between different ethnic groups in the schizophrenia risk score.
So do you recall offhand if the polygenic scores of the current world populations that there is genetic data for, do these relate to the official prevalences, like the governments report or like non-profits estimate?
Not very well, because for example the African polygenic score for schizophrenia is very high, several standard deviations higher than the East Asian or European one, but the official prevalence of schizophrenia in Africa is not that high, but that's probably because of the different diagnostic criteria. But if we compare different racial groups living in the same country, for example, I've looked up studies of comparing blacks and whites in Sweden, in the Netherlands, and the US. Blacks have higher rates of schizophrenia and also much higher polygenic scores for schizophrenia.
So it would seem that once you kind of equalize the environment and the measurement, then the polygenics are more in line, the polygenic scores are more in line with the phenotypes we observe. How about the East Asians? How do they rate here?
The East Asians have very similar levels to Europeans, which is also, it's in line with the epidemiological data we have from Western countries, where they are pretty similar in the schizophrenia rates as to whites.
Okay. If we were to be extra speculative, in psychiatry you can talk about the P factor, which is kind of this general index of mental problems, the general psychopathology factor, and but you can also break this down to certain other dimensions. If you say there's an overall trend where any diagnosis gives you an increased chance of any other diagnosis, maybe not exactly all of them, but very close to all of them. But you could also say that in some ways schizophrenia is the opposite of autism, where autism is characterized by an under-perceiving agency that exists, where autists are very bad at picking up human cues, people looking at them in strange ways, and they don't notice this as actually reflecting agency, where schizophrenia would be over-perceiving agency, like kind of taking slights where someone looked at you in a funny way. Maybe that's because they hate you. Now you need to be angry at them. And autism is like you will under-perceive these things, so you wouldn't spot the danger coming if someone is sleeping with your wife and these two people are looking at each other a bit too happily. So it would seem that maybe autism has a negative effect in this sense, and And schizophrenia could have a positive sense. It helps you perceive, and there would be an optimal level on this autism schizophrenia dimension. So based on the ancient data that you told us about, it would seem that everybody is heading towards more autism. This could be considered consistent with our increased emphasis on science and technology, and not using anecdotes, but doing randomized controlled trials and kind of formal deductive reasoning, as opposed to this kind of intuition approach.
Yes. Yeah, the decrease in the schizophrenia genetic predisposition could be due to a selection for, or it will actually mirror, and we don't know which way the causal effect goes. It could mirror our tendencies for rational thinking and to be less superstitious than our ancestors.
The next question concerns the cold winters theory, and the cold winters theory, for those not familiar with it, watching this, the cold winters theory is an attempt at to explain the worldwide variation we see in average intelligence levels, where you see generally, if you take country populations as they are in current countries, and you take these as a proxy for people who evolved in these locations, which means you have to exclude the new worlds, which were mostly settled with now are inhabited by Europeans mixed with Native Americans and some African slaves later. But if we focus on the old world, so everywhere from West Africa and West Europe all the way over to Asia, but not including the Americas, these are, not in all cases, a few of them are settler countries, but most of them are non-settlers, so that you would have about 120 countries or so with roughly original stock of population. And if you take the various climatical measures of these countries, you can take average summer temperatures, average summer colds, like the lowest altitudes, all kinds of these climatical factors, and think of it as a kind of biologist would approach it. So if you're a biologist, you come out and see all these kind of subversions or subspecies or breeds of some new fish, and you record all the climates in the different place these fish live. You try to figure out what seems to be driving the evolution here. And so when you do this with humans, what you get from comparing the climate data is that one factor stands out above all the others, and it's the temperature of winters, and the low temperature of winters, the cold winters. That's the origin of this theory. It's not really that someone sat around with an armchair and came up with this. Came out of, let's take a biological perspective and look at all the climatical factors, and this one is empirically the strongest one. I know I've looked into some modern data to see, was this maybe a coincidence of some of these older, I think the first study on this was published in 2000 sometime by Arikawa and Templer. But I've tried the modern IQ estimates for countries and modern temperature data, and this didn't change the results. It was still by far the strongest one. But so the question of the viewer is that there are some obvious anomalies with this model. So, for instance, now we are in Italy. How does the cold winters theory explain the fact that the first advanced white civilizations, or just civilizations in general, all arose in the temperate Mediterranean climate? So maybe you have a guess.
Yes, my guess is that the cold winters were at a positive eugenic effect. There were a positive selective pressure on intelligence when the status of civilization was not advanced. So during, for example, the Stone Age, when the biggest threat to life and reproduction was a natural phenomena or predatory animals or disease, and in this or even keeping yourself warm. In this situation, in this environment, a cold climate would require higher intelligence to survive. But once people developed civilizations and they managed to shield themselves from the natural environment, not completely, but to a large extent, the selection pressures from the social environment became stronger. So the social selection, gene culture coevolution became stronger, and social complexity became the main driver of evolution. And so that's why there was a positive feedback loop whereby more complex societies selected for more intelligence, and then more intelligence selected for even more complex societies, up until the point where probably there was like in ancient Rome there was the opposite trend. And but another objection to this theory is that what I recall is that what is more important is the seasonalities, not actually the raw temperature. So it's also probably like extremely if you go too far north, like for example the Inuit, their climate is not enough variable. So they probably they didn't have this enough pressure on their skills.
There are many potential ways, but what I think is the most important fact to recognize with the cold winters theory is that it's not supposed to be a theory that explains everything. It is not a theory of every human group's absolute high ranking or rank order in intelligence. It's supposed to be the main theory. So let's say their cold winters could maybe explain 70% of the group differences we see over time. Sometimes there are anomalies. So like the ones...
the Native Americans are an anomaly because they evolved in Siberia. They split from the East Asians in Siberia, so they were in a very cold climate. Also the Inuit. But these people don't have an extremely high level of intelligence.
No, but they're also not particularly low either. So from this perspective, you could say the Inuit is an outlier, or you could say Europeans are an outlier. Maybe we're too high for our temperature.
Think about the East Asians. There is not a significant difference between the South Chinese and the North Chinese, or like the Mongolians. The Mongolians live like in one of the coldest places in the world, but they are not. Their IQ is not as high as that of the Chinese that live in warmer climate, from Hong Kong or southern China. So, and in this case, I think you can explain this because China was much more densely populated for a much longer time. So there was the social competition created a selective pressure, but there is overall there is evidence for the importance of cold winters theory, because for example I found a moderate positive correlation between latitude, which is how far from the equator you are, and which is a good proxy for cold climate, and the polygeny scores for education. Although this relationship is not linear, because it seems to peak at some intermediate latitude.
Yes.
For example, the Yakuts don't have despite living in the very cold climate, they don't have very high polygeny scores.
Well, so the Yakut IQ, as I recall from some recent Russian studies, they are about 95 or so, slightly below the Russians.
Yeah, exactly.
But considering that they live in colder climates than what we assume ancient Russians or East Slavs used to do, they would seem that they should be smarter, but there can be the counteracting factor that caused that their population density was very small, and so it's difficult to spread. If you get a new mutation or you have a mutation, this mutation has to spread through the population. When your infected population size is quite small, then this slows down evolution. And you could say the same thing for the Inuits, where farming was never done by the Inuits in Greenland. The Vikings tried farming in Greenland, and they died out after some time when the climate changed a bit. But the Indians, the Inuits, never really farmed. So they've been living essentially like hunter-gatherers And it's possible that, yes, Davide says the transition between these different forms of subsistence for humans changes the selection speed or even sometimes the direction. My favorite pet hypothesis that has so far not been tested, but I will set out the anecdote, or not the anecdote, but the evidence I could think of so far, which is that I've noticed that the Balkans and people who live in South Slavs are quite much lower than the other Europeans who live at the same latitude and approximately the same heat. So Italians are much smarter than Albanians, even at the same latitude, and some similar effects. One reason for this could be the altitude, that there's some mountains here, and mountains would also make your population have a lower population density and theoretically slow down evolution for this, or maybe change the selection pressure. And there are some other cases of this in the Caucasus area, which is also very cold and very bad winters. The people who live in the Caucasus area are much lower intelligence than you would expect based on the climate data, even though these are Caucasians. I mean, they give origin to the word Caucasian. So they are also an anomaly. And the final example I found is Tibetans in China. I think have IQs in the 85 or thereabouts, so roughly the same as African Americans.
Also Peruvians.
Peruvians. There's some data on the Latin America where the people who live higher in the mountains have higher IQs than the people who live closer to the shore. This evidence is ambiguous. It can be self-selection. Maybe the people in the mountains are just more Amerindian, or there's been selective migration south, which it seems likely. Nevertheless, there is some of this evidence that points in this mountain theory of intelligence, if we should call it that. So this is something I hope to look into in the future, if we can somehow figure out a data set where we have like different ethnic groups and where approximate altitude they evolved at, no matter where they currently live, at just approximate altitude. I guess the Nepalese would be an interesting example. The next question is about, let's see, this one. This is one we talked about already with Galton's claim about the ancient Greeks and about in the many thousands of genomes that are coming out, when we can expect to have a kind of final verdict on this Galton Greek hypothesis.
The pace at which these ancient genomes are being released, published, is very high. So I expect in the next couple of years we will be able to.
So like 2-3 years or
yeah.
So, yeah. I would agree with this. His next question is if we think, or if we agree with Galton's estimate that the ancient Greeks would be comparably to roughly 130 or 115 or so.
At least the ancient Athenians.
the ancient Athenians.
Or from this particular, the golden age of
yeah. I mean, it is possible. It brings back to this typical discussion of genius, where what Galton's method consisted of taking the population density or the population estimate that he could surmise based on the data he had available in Victorian times, and then the number of Greek geniuses in this time according to historical records, and you can divide these to get the genius rate. And if you compare this to, say, the modern or the Victorian age that he was living in, which is also one of the highest, or the Italian, the North Italian Renaissance or the Dutch Renaissance, and these rates, the Greeks had the highest rates of geniuses. And if you're willing to make certain normal distribution assumptions with this, you can of course compute the mean IQs, which is what Galton did. The objection to this kind of estimate would be that it was much easier to be a genius in ancient Greek. Nothing is discovered. You're just kind of starting up with a blank slate.
Low-hanging fruit.
Low-hanging fruit, right? Aristotle, sits around, thinks very hard about logic, comes up with some patterns of logic that make sense. He has a book on the animals, right, which consists of kind of a broad.
A lot of knowledge was borrowed from other countries. There was no copyright and no very authorship a lot of knowledge was transmitted through schools, not in a written form, and a lot of texts were anonymous. So there were. It was very easy to just copy some text from Alexandra's library or some Babylonian text and just claim it's your own text. Plagiarism was not an issue like it is now. So it's difficult to compare the rate of creativity at the time to our modern rate.
So the final here would be if only we had the Library of Alexandria, we could check whether the ancient Greeks were really supreme geniuses or supreme plagiarists.
Yeah.
It would be a funny one. We have another question about the cold winters here, but this is the one we already covered about the mountain and the Albanians and the Bulgarians. Some of these. The next question here is a kind of interesting one related to your current AI worries or AI hopes, depending on which side of the debate you're on. We have a Rat King asking, at what point did humans peak cognitively? Are we at our peak now, or is there some speculation that the Victorians were smarter than us, or the ancient Greeks maybe? When is peak human cognitive performance, you think?
Well, there is not apparently. It's like it's difficult to say because it depends on the place. So different places have at different peaks. For example, in the case of Italy, it could be the Roman Republic or the Renaissance. In the case of England, it could be the Victorian age. So it depends on the area, but in general, the peak tend to be modern time because there was this trend for higher intelligence continued throughout modern times. So, like, probably my guess would be it was like in the early 20th century in general, and then it was followed by this genic trend.
So the question here would be the more complicated one of how to answer the Flynn effect worries with measurement, because of course we now know that from biobank genetic data that the polygenic scores have certainly declined in modern times. We know this from the UK biobank, we know this from the Icelandic study, and I'm sure there'll be some other studies soon showing.
We have like the reaction time data showing us
some reaction time data. But to be fair, of course, we have reaction times that get slower in multiple countries. It used to be the Woodley meta-analysis based on the Victorian comparison, but there is also a longitudinal Sweden study showing that even Swedes in the 1970s, I think, have slower reaction times or faster reaction times than the Swedes in the 1990s. So it would seem that this reaction time decline is definitely for real, which would be kind of the opposite of what you'd think based on the increased prevalence of modern technology, where computer games often has a reaction time component. It would seem like from a training perspective, the humans should be increasingly trained to have higher reaction time, and yet they keep going down.
Yeah, also the driving emphasis is on reaction time. So if almost everyone has to learn how to drive nowadays, and to be a good driver, you need to have fast reaction times.
But on the other hand, we could say that there's a lot of standard IQ tests that we've been measuring intelligence with since the 1905 or so, when the Binet first tests came around. And if you look over time with these more complicated tests or complex mental tests, like vocabulary size or ability to tell people kind of abstract similarity between two objects, the similarities test, or these like matrix reasoning tests like the Ravens. These tests show some of them show not just a small increase, but like a 30 points increase.
A possibility is that the reaction time reflect more like a hardware component, whereas these tests reflect like kind of like a software, like an improvement in our software due to our environment. So our software got better, but there was like due to the environments we live in, but there was a decrease in the genetic predisposition.
It's one speculative way of dealing with this.
That's my idea.
From my perspective, I think the Flynn effect is mysterious, and no one really knows what's going on. Some tests go up, some tests go down. You can rate things by abstract levels. People used to think that, or still think to some extent, that non-verbal tests are particularly pure measures of general intelligence of G factor. But then the prime error, like in the non-verbal test, the Raven test, shows one of the largest increases, which doesn't make any sense from this, shall we say, old school kind of hereditarian perspective. One of the other ones that show basically no trends is the ability to do basic arithmetic, which is would be very mysterious if people have gotten smarter over time, as you would think from the Raven test scores or similarities tests. Then why can they not use basic arithmetic?
They didn't have calculators, so they had to do...
No, these are all results from non-calculator data, right? It's interviewer...
No, but because now people in school...
I see what you mean.
When they get homework or a test, they can just use the calculator.
I see.
But in the old times, they had to do it by heart or using
I see what you're saying,
pencil and paper.
You could make a similar ad hoc theory for plausible hypothesis, as we call it here. For the
this is my ad hoc explanation.
For digit span, which, as I recall, also shows roughly no trends. So maybe forward digit span is getting a bit better in some meta-analysis, and the backwards digit span is getting a bit worse. So you could come up with some complicated speculation where, well, since people use more calculators now, they don't need to memorize a lot of numbers in the head like they used to do when they had to do like long division in your head or on paper. Whereas people could go like, what's 12 plus 12 times 7? Like then, calculator, right? Before they would turn out the...
Exactly, so this reliance on calculators can have an impact on our ability to do mental arithmetics.
Yes,
and we could test this by also observing measuring the trend in other mental tasks that have been impacted by technology. We could draw a list of them and then compare their trend across time based on their how much they were impacted by technology and see if there was an interaction.
Right. It's just that I think there's a quite limited set of cognitive tests that we have long data on. Like obviously we have the old Stanford Binet test, but these were given to kids. So for instance, if you see that people are getting higher scores over time on the Stanford Binet, maybe this isn't adult intelligence increasing, maybe it's just children mature earlier, and so so we've kind of sped up developmental speed, but not necessarily increased intelligence of adults. But as I recall, there's multiple meta-analyses of the Flynn effect, which mostly show that the increase seems to be roughly constant everywhere. Even across ethnic groups in the US, the speed is the same, which is difficult to explain with some of these environmental theories where, let's say, access to computers helped you train your cognitive skills playing games or just like using programming or whatever it is people do on computers, and this would train your various skill sets, your reasoning abilities, resulting in these increased results in the IQ tests. But when you see the rate of improvement is roughly constant across wealthy and less wealthy ethnic groups within the US, it makes it difficult to come up with a consistent explanation for this fact, right?
You mean like because these different groups have a different rate of technology adoption?
Exactly. Yeah. So this seems to be Richard Lynn, who unfortunately died recently, he pointed out these inconsistencies. If you can come up with all these hypothetical technologies that humans adopted and this helped boost, which is kind of a typical James Flynn thing, scientific goggles, this sort of spectacles, this sort of thing. As Lynn is pointing out, it seems the increase seems to affect just about everybody.
My theory is that we don't know like the origin of the Flynn effect. I think that the guy who actually would be able to explain it should get a Nobel Prize.
That is maybe possible, yeah. But moving from a Nobel Prize to other Nobel Prize we have one commenter who's interested in learning about the Ashkenazi history of intelligence. So most viewers are probably familiar with the Ashkenazi intelligence, the Jewish, but specifically the German Jews score somewhere between 110, 115, depending on which sample, when from the U.S. Jews, whatever. Israeli Jews are a bit lower. So there's a theory by Greg Cochran and what's the other guy's called? A natural history of Jewish intelligence, or Ashkenazi intelligence, which is that the kind of Jews arose in the Middle Ages or maybe the late antiquity, and they were essentially people or tradesmen from Judea, from Israel, and they migrated to Italy, maybe South France, but somewhere in this area, and they took local wives while they were merchants. And since they are merchants, which is a difficult occupation when everybody else is a peasant, the merchant profession would tend to select more for intelligence than being a peasant would. And so on this theory, the Jews would evolve higher intelligence faster at a faster rate than the other surrounding populations.
This comes back to our theory. That social cultural selection can be very strong and trump the natural selection from the climate or the environment in general. And yes, there is some preliminary evidence for this, because we have like a small medieval Jewish sample published by the Reich team, David Reich team, and their polygenic scores for education are like lower than modern Europeans even. So it seems like the speed of increase of the polygenic scores among Jews was even higher than among Gentiles.
Which would be the central claim of this model, that ideally we would find some ancient pre-European mixed Jews from Israel, but comparable ones, and we would find some of the earliest Jews you can find in Italy or in South France or wherever, and we would keep note their intelligence, the polygenic scores over time, and as they kind of move around, they should come in initially with some increase, because these are merchants, not peasants, so they should be elite for their origin population. Once they get in Europe, they should be self-selecting for eliteness faster, or for more intelligence faster than the other Europeans, or the Europeans, the Gentiles. And so since we only currently have, to my knowledge, we only have the Eufert, the medieval German Jews.
And the problem with this sample is that it's from the same cemetery, same burial place, so it's not a representative sample of medieval Jews. So we need more samples of ancient Jews.
So that's our message to the Jewish community watching this. Please convince your fellow Jews that we need to sequence more ancient Jews so we can prove your natural superiority.
Jesus for sure was not stupid, so maybe there were already some high IQ genes among the ancient Jews.
Moving out from purely our genetic discussion so far, with all the evolution and polygenic scores and ancient samples and sequencing techniques, if we get so far, there's one reader who has a question about the impact of the smart fraction compared to the average intelligence. I don't know if you have a theory, of course. I would myself, with Noah Kahl, we published a paper on this 1 year ago or so, where we looked into this, and so the main answer to this would be that you can try to estimate the distribution of each population using PISA data, basically. It's the only kind of data that has this. Richard Lynn's compilations of natural IQs have not in general been recording the different centiles, and the underlying data is not shared, so it's not possible to go back and recompute it. You can use the standard deviations themselves, but these are often incomparable, or just kind of odd distributions, or what is it called, restriction of range issues like ceiling effects, which makes the standard errors incomprehensible. But using the PISA data, which is only from 15-year-olds or so, you have many years of data. You can calculate how smart is the top 5 smartest student on average from each of these countries. Do that for every year across every test. You can put these on a common scale. You can do the same thing for the bottom 5% student, and also for the mean student from a given country. So from this way you can kind of estimate a kind of a potentially asymmetric normal distribution where there might be a long tail if there's a larger than expected amount of smart people, or a long left tail if there's a larger amount of dull people. And of course on the smart fraction theory is that the size of the right tail is important for the development of societies, because these are the people who come up with the new inventions and who are good with starting new businesses and so on. The problem with this data is that when you take the scores from the PISA, what you find is that the average ability of a country correlates, I think it's 9.7 with within the right tail ability, which means that essentially you cannot run a regression on this with a sample size of only 100.
There's no power.
There's not enough statistical precision for this. You will get some nonsense estimates because of the extreme collinearity. Yes. So we came up with this alternative approach, which is not without its faults, but it at least gets you somewhere, which is that for each country you say try to predict the score of the top 5% smartest students, and you predict this from the average student, and to the degree that the top students are smarter than you would expect based on the average students, that means that the tail is longer. So you're essentially getting a number that tells you tells you the lengths of the right tail, and you can do the same thing for the left tail. And so you get these two parameters telling you about how the normal distribution sort of looks like. And if you do this, then these measures become uncorrelated, because you've now removed the mean from the other ones. So now they're uncorrelated, but you can put them in a regression and you won't get any problems. And if the smart fraction theory is correct, then generally you should see that the smart fraction predicts better outcomes, and the dull fraction does not do so to the same extent, or maybe not at all. But what we found in our study was basically what the smart fraction theory says. The countries with the larger smart fractions, even holding constant the average intelligence of countries, do better on not every outcome you could measure, but most of them with a p-value of 1% or less. And on average it was quite a bit. You could improve it.
I have a question, because you studied this more in depth than me. What do you think could be the causes of higher variance, of different variances in IQ between countries? Why do you think some countries have higher apart from like the ethnic composition? Like if we are talking about ethnically homogeneous countries, why do you think some countries will have higher variance in cognitive ability?
I would generally think it's mainly about the ethnic composition, or kind of it doesn't even have to be ethnic. It could just be, take for instance like southern and northern Italians. In some sense these are the same ethnic group, in some sense they're not. They're kind of a continuum.
So it's what geneticists call population structure, like a higher level of population structure.
I would guess it's mostly population structure, if not entirely. But if you were to speculate a bit in behavioral or in behavioral genetics terms, you could say that if you have a high environmental impact in some society, then theoretically the variance of the IQ should also be higher, because you have this additional environmental causation. And if the genetic variance doesn't somehow decrease in response to this, if there's not some kind of strange variance interaction going on, then generally speaking, modern variance in IQ or variability in intelligence should actually have been decreasing over time, because we've been increasing the environment to be more equalized. I don't know if it's possible to compare this over time. This is kind of a secondary Flynn effect, not just as the mean going up, but the variance should also become smaller. And I know the Danish army test shows this pattern. So there's kind of the rise of the little guy, as one scholar who studied this said. And I don't know if this has been generally confirmed, but it would be in line with this. So, but based on this theory, you would get that if we look between countries and ethnic groups in them, then essentially poorer countries should have higher variance, and therefore, to some extent, they would also have, to the extent that this variance is not even, they might have a strong smart fraction or they might not. Depends on ethnic subgroups.
Yes.
In Africa, of course, many countries have kind of random borders because they were drawn by Europeans who said, well, my colony goes to the end of this parallel and then down.
And also coming to Africa, like Africa is an interesting case because we know that Africa has more genetic variation within it than other continents, because this is where like humans originated, modern humans originated, and I wonder if this large amount of genetic variance between African populations is also it translates into higher genetic variance for intelligence. I guess I don't know if we have enough IQ data or polygenic score data to actually test this hypothesis. We have some populations from 1,000 genomes from Eastern and Western Africa, but from what I could see, there was no big difference between Eastern and Western Africans.
So from the perspective of statistical genetics, if they have more variance in frequencies, but these go in random directions, then maybe this wouldn't affect the standard deviation of a sum score, like a polygenic score. I'm not sure. I had to go test my intuition. But it's a common argument you hear that higher. Even some economists famously base their like big growth theory on this kind of reasoning. But I have a blog post arguing that it's false, and I reviewed the various American data from different ethnic groups showing that their standard deviations are mostly the same, and they're unrelated to the standard deviations. And in fact, if there is any difference, then maybe the African American standard deviation is a bit smaller instead of larger, because not only is it roughly 80% African, which has a higher genetic diversity, but it is also 20% European, which would give even larger genetic diversity, and yet the standard deviation of this group is either no larger or maybe even slightly smaller, at least if you look at the recent ABCD data, which I think showed very close to the same standard deviations. There's only one final question, the question before the final question, the final reader question. So it's about Thomas Sowell argued that West Indian blacks' greater success in the US disproved explanations that racism or slavery were the main reason for the disparities observed in the US. And so this is his theory, that instead they would have a kind of cultural origin, and that the West Indies or the Caribbean blacks, when they came to the US, they must have been doing better at the time that Thomas Sowell was writing, I think in the 70s or the 80s. This was back when the kind of the Great Societies was kind of getting on the way. It wasn't really showing the big improvements promised for, so there were some conservatives like Thomas Sowell would come up with like maybe the theory they like the racism and the slavery theory is kind of incorrect, and so it's really a question for me maybe, because I recently had a blog post. I replied to the libertarian economist David Friedman, and he repeated this Sowell argument. So I decided to look up the modern status of Caribbean Americans, and it turns out the modern Caribbean Americans actually are below average in income. So maybe they're a bit better than African Americans, but they're not like much better. They're maybe slightly better, so it seems there's no big mystery to explain with the.
And the population of Haiti is not particularly wealthy or
Right.
educated. It's actually one of the most dangerous countries in the world, and
Right.
with the lowest education.
So you would wonder from this perspective if the Caribbeans supposedly brought some great culture with them compared to the African Americans, then why isn't this culture doing very well back in their home countries? So why do they need to go to America with this? Isn't it easier to just think that initially the people who came from the Caribbeans to the US were they were positively selected for being more elite, in the same way that we see elite Nigerians and some other, even South Africans. Of course, South Africans are mostly white returnees or sometimes Jews that come back. So it would seem a much easier explanation to just explain this in terms of self-selection of immigration rather than some magical cultural effects that doesn't work at home. So that was the last the reader question. So if you have any last things you would like to add, then
no, I think we covered everything we were asked. And
yeah, maybe tell the reader what the future holds for your research the next coming year.
Yeah, I keep checking my Twitter account for updates on my publications, because there will be lots of new interesting papers coming about ancient genomes and the test of the cyclical model of civilization and Gregory Clark's theory. And the final goal is actually tracking the human population through all over the world through time and space. So if anyone interested in history, genetics and psychology and human biological differences will find a lot of very interesting material in our publications.
All right, and with that said, I would like to say skål to the viewers, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Prosit.
Prosit.